It's exactly a year on from Apple Silicon's first Macs dropping, and what a change it's made. We've had the M1 Max now for a full year, and to be honest, it's been a hell of a year. We started out with that event that had all the vague graphs, seemingly specifically to bait the PC fanboys into talking about the M1, including Linus Sebastian at Linus Tech Tips, who called the event a slow-motion dumpster fire, followed by a sheepish Apple destroyed my expectations video, praising everything from the general speed to being completely stunned by how well Rosetta was able to run x86 software.
My skepticism of Apple's vague and optimistic performance claims didn't exactly scream enthusiastic. But make no mistake, now that it's in my hands, I am super enthusiastic.
The tests kept coming, and time after time, even Apple's fanless MacBook Air was demolishing anything even remotely in its class in both Geekbench scores and real-world tests. Then, in the spring, the iMac got the first redesign of the Apple Silicon era, heavily referencing the first iMacs in its friendly light colour schemes, as well as getting drastically thinner to boot. M1 also came to the iPad Pro, giving us our first taste of mini-LED displays in something costing less than $5,000. But then WWDC came and went without any hardware, contrary to popular belief, and we had to wait until October for our next taste. And what a taste it has been. M1 Pro and M1 Max MacBook Pros with genuinely insane performance in a slightly bigger enclosure, complete with a suite of ports, new cameras, new display technology, and a design that again references the history of the PowerBook G4. But still to come, we've got overhauls of the MacBook Air, introducing the M2 chip, the larger iMac that's expected to arrive in Q1 of 2022 with M1 Pro and M1 Max options, and perhaps our first look at Face ID in a Mac. The Mac Mini is also expected to pick up a redesign that nods to the original G4 Mac Mini design with the Perspex top and aluminium sides. That will leave just the Mac Pro. And while we've heard it could have up to 40 CPU cores and 128 GPU cores, we have no idea right now if it will be in any way user upgradable. But it does look like it will use multiple M1 Max SoCs in parallel, perhaps in an elongated Mac Mini style chassis. So the future's looking pretty bright. The past is looking amazing already, so I just can't wait to see what the performance of these new Macs is going to be. But next up, a quick message about our 10,000 subscriber events. Quick reminder everyone, don't forget to send me your Memoji either on Twitter or on Instagram or via an email, because we need them to go on the t-shirt for the 100,000 subs. Thank you! And let's get into your iCave answers. Marcin Kowalczyk asks, do you think that Apple anticipated Alder Lake and that's why we got M1 Max, not only M1 Pro? No, not really, because the difference between M1 Pro and M1 Max is purely in the GPU side of things and those ProRes decoder blocks. There's no real difference at all. In fact, there's no difference whatsoever in terms of the CPU, which is what Alder Lake is. That's not really the priority with those. It's all about the fact they've got the big little architecture, very much like the M1 and the M1 Pro. Thomas Rundle asks, iCave Answers, when will we see you on Genius Bar? We know John watches these videos, so hopefully he invites you at some stage. Honestly, I'd love to go on the show, but I don't think I'm kind of the level that they're looking for at the minute. They've got Brian Tong going on, they've had Luke Miani, they've had Quinn from Snazzy Labs. I'm not quite in that league just yet, but I really appreciate the mention. James Apple asks, will the iPad Pro get updated every year since it gets the same M1 chip as the iMac, the MacBook Air, the Mac Mini, the base level MacBook Pro? So I've said for a while, I think Apple's intent is to get everything to having these annual updates. I think the reason that we've had the delays at the moment and not kind of pushed through these as quickly as Apple probably wanted to, is more about getting those redesigns, getting the tooling in place, making sure that the production works and everything else. We know that the chips already work. The M1 was already in place. The M1 Pro and M1 Max, we assume, were built around about April last year, which would make sense. And yes, I do think that Apple does want to put the base Mac chip into the iPad Pros every year, because the base Mac chip, the M1 at least, would have been the A14X. They added a few extra chunks of silicon to it. Things like the hypervisor, which helps with Rosetta and with virtualization. They added the Thunderbolt controllers rather than using regular USB-C, things like that. But at its essence, the M1 is an A14X, exactly what we would have expected for an A14X. So yeah, that is the iPad Pro chip. So the M2, assuming that they are going to come out with annual updates, it's going to be 18 months probably before we see the M2 after the M1 was launched, or somewhere around that point at least. But I think going forward, they're going to be looking to get it into that annual turnover. Once we've got all the redesigns out, that shouldn't be too much of a difficulty. Mine Dirchkurs asks, iCave Answers, could you please do a quick overview about binning? How does it work? How do they figure out the parts that are damaged? Is it possible to unbin a CPU or GPU by settings on hardware? So yeah, this is basically, binned chips are chips where individual cores from the silicon production process are not working properly. So Apple is able to disable those cores. This is through like firmware flashing, so that they're not causing issues for the rest of the chip. Now, a damaged core could just be from some sort of dust in the clean rooms where the silicon is being made, that just basically stops a small part of the chip working. There will be some chips where too many cores are damaged, or, you know, some area of the chip for some reason is unsuccessful, and those will have to be basically thrown out. But what the binning does is uses the chips that have individual cores that are not working, or that would be running at too high power levels, for example, because there's an error, something like that, allows those to be used by disabling those cores. Now, the way that it's tested, my assumption is that these SoCs are basically activated, they run self-diagnostics, that reports back to the system, tells them which cores might cause an issue, and then a flash will happen that disables those cores. In terms of whether you can re-enable them in the hardware that you have already, I assume it wouldn't be completely impossible, but I think you would need very specialist equipment that you probably do not have, because it's in the Apple factory or at TSMC. And if you did enable them, you would probably find that the chips would either fail entirely, not work at all, or they would be overheating, using far too much power, or whatever else the issues might have been that were caused on these SoCs. So, even if you can, you probably shouldn't. And a quick interlude by Morning Edit Time Dave. Just a quick one. It looks like Apple is moving to a multiple die chiplet kind of style design, so they're potentially going to have two different chips that are kind of attached together in the new MacBooks or in the new M series processors. And I think the reason that they're going to do that is that it means the smaller your individual chunks are, the more flexibility you have in terms of binning. The smaller the chunks are, the less likely you are to have a number of cores that are inoperable, and it also means you're able to mix and match. So you might have one die that's got 3 missing CPUs that wouldn't be any use, but it might have a perfect GPU of 16, perfect GPU bank of 16. So I think it'll just give them a lot more flexibility in terms of matching up the good CPUs with the good GPUs, as long as they're not going to have enough of a penalty to worry about in terms of the fabric. Hopefully that makes sense. Greg West asks, iCave Answers, is it odd that Tim Cook is linked to cryptocurrency when its reputation for massive energy use flies in the face of all that is green? Apple prides itself on energy conservation and the use of renewable sources, suggesting that Apple may be investing in crypto is like saying that they're seriously looking into coal. I 100% understand where you're coming from here. However, it's not one of these things that is unsurmountable. So, although at the moment a lot of crypto, especially in terms of when the transactions happen, does use ridiculous amounts of energy. I think an Ethereum transaction uses about as much as a small house to do a single transaction, which is astonishingly silly. There are cryptocurrencies now that are being developed that use storage as your proof of work, basically, rather than using the energy that you would need in terms of doing calculations. So it may be that there's some stuff down the line that uses that. So it's more about the silicon production, the storage that you have available, rather than the energy that's being used up in transaction processing. That's a possibility. But in terms of Apple using it, if Tim is just buying on bulk a single transaction, that doesn't really make a huge dent. Yes, I understand where you're coming from, but it's also, this is happening regardless of whether Apple likes it or not, or whether governments like it or not, because it is decentralized. There's nobody that can kind of regulate it from that point of view. So I think it's important still that Apple understands what's going on there and understands what the importance of cryptocurrency is and is ready to do it, because if they don't, someone else will anyway, and Apple might be able to steer this thing in towards more efficient chips and in towards using renewable energy for the transaction processing, for example. But I think you also have to remember that Apple is not Tim Cook. Tim Cook is not Apple, although he represents the company. What he does with his money in his own time, which has already left the company, I don't think is really necessarily a reflection on the company as a whole. So I'd just bear that in mind as well. So that's it for today's show, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you've got a question, hashtag #IGaveAnswers. Don't forget to send me your emojis, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, because that's what will make me a happy, happy boy. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.